Okay, so let's get going. Now we get to the nub of the matter. I've presented to you the idea of activities oriented by object concepts as the substance and units of human social life, together with the logic of development of activities from mere potential to being taken for granted integral aspects of everyday life. And I've presented a synopsis of Hegel's logic as a logical narrative of the development of concepts, from being nothing through to being an integral part of the self-concept of an entire social formation. I've further suggested that concepts are norms of human activity. It only remains to draw the logical conclusion that it's not that concepts are related to activities in some way, but simply that concepts are activities and vice versa, and no meaningful distinction can be drawn between them. This provides a definite, meaningful, and useful interpretation of the already widely held thesis that human activity constitutes the real subject matter of Hegel's logic. First difficulty that confronts us in accepting this idea is the deeply ingrained prejudice embodied in the words activities and concepts. It is a habit of thought that we think of a concept as something which exists inside somebody's head, or if not inside the head, because after all, Descartes knew that thoughts did not have spatial reality, something merely implicit with a merely implicit existence. On the other hand, the word activities connotes behavior, physical movements, something material rather than something imagined or thought. These are real differences, but our use of the terms only demonstrates how deeply ingrained in us is the dreaded Cartesian dualism. And that's no surprise. We are born realists after all. And the difference between something I'm merely imagining and something that really exists outside my consciousness is the first and most basic distinction we learn to make, and our lives depend on it. The way we use these terms is really a synecdoche. I have trouble with this word, I'm sorry. Synecdoche. That is a figure of speech in which you refer to the whole by the reference to only a part of the whole. Like an employer says, I have so many hands in my factory. Right? Here, the ideal or the material. The activities and concepts essentially both material and ideal. Ideal refers to entities and properties which attach to their social significance. The ideal includes both forms of consciousness and objective material processes. Ideal and material are not mutually exclusive categories. Ideals may also be material. The identity of activities and concepts is also obscured by the dualism that affects the three moments of concepts and activities. Reference to a concept usually fail to evoke all three moments of the concept, the individual, particular, and universal moments, which are all essential to the existence of the concept. When we use a word to evoke a concept, we may be referring to an individual instance, or we might be speaking generally or even hypothetically. Likewise, when we talk about activities, we can obscure the fact that it is a normative or ideal object of an activity, which transforms actions into moments of the activity, and that it is only the inclusion of an artifact in such actions which gives the artifact meaning. That is, the ideal object, the constituent actions, and the included artifacts are all essential moments of an activity, even though in a given speech act, we may be evoking just one moment. My claim for the identity of concepts and activities relies on the tripartite structure of both activities and concepts. The identity further relies on the identity of the life cycle of both representations, but I will begin by pointing out the identity of activities and concepts at that moment in the development of an activity when it is an institution. So, for example, look at how we talk about hospitals. Suppose we are talking about an individual hospital, such as the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and whether the RMH deserves the name of hospital. We could make this claim only by affirming that a range of individual actions are indeed collaboratively oriented towards the restoration of patients to medical health. This This is the normative conception of a hospital, and observation of the actions of employees, patients, and other people and various relations to the hospital should confirm this. But these individual actions relate to the normative object of the hospital in a variety of particular ways, from the administrative action of the bursar to the caring and supportive care of the nurses and the medical work of the doctors. Whether the hospital is a true hospital as opposed to a poor or dysfunctional hospital would depend on whether the patients indeed do leave the hospital in better health than that in which they were admitted. So you see, there is an alignment between the individual, particular, and universal moments of the activity in the concept of hospital. The RMH is a real living instance of the concept of hospital, an instance of a hospital. By focusing on an individual hospital, we can see the symmetry between the moments more clearly than if I were to simply address the concept of hospital, which implies reference to the consciousness of everyone, whether or not their consciousness is directly engaged in the actual instantiation of a hospital. But the being of a hospital depends first and above all, but not only, on the actions which make up the hospital. What is the situation then if we're talking about hospitals in general? Firstly, there is the universal moment, namely that hospitals are healthcare facilities, part of a country's healthcare system. They play a particular role in that health system, which differs from that of GP clinics, pharmacies, and so forth. This draws my attention to the fact that the normative concept which orients the action of all the employees in a hospital has to be made more concrete than I just indicated. The concept of a hospital differs from that of a GP clinic or a suicide helpline. Various concepts differ in the scope, technology, methods, and standards which characterize the normative concepts of those constituent actions. On the other hand, in talking of hospitals in general, the relevant actions are more those of the patients, the government, and health service workers in general, which instantiate this or that activity as a hospital, attending it when they're sick, referring patients there, funding it, and so on, treating it as a hospital, in other words. The relevant artifacts include the hospital buildings, though no one would mistake a hospital building for a hospital as such. In this context, it is the actions by which people relate to an activity as part of the larger activity, the entire community, which constitutes the being of hospitals. If GPs never refer patients there, sick people never go there, and governments never fund it, whatever the people engaged in the activity may think, they are not realizing a hospital. They may be acting in an episode of ER, perhaps. I've used hospital to illustrate the identity of concepts and activities in ideal objects, processes, and materials. It's easily seen, surely, that governments, fashions, theories, private businesses, families, and so on, are also ideal objects in which the identity of concepts and activities is equally straightforward. Likewise, economic entities and attributes like property, beauty, wealth, and so on, are ideal entities or attributes which are instantiated by and only by human actions as part of various relevant activities, not by any physical or chemical properties. The connection of these ideal entities to material objects and processes is understood to be more or less remote, sometimes very remote, but in any case is entirely determined by social norms and laws. If I say that is my property, I'm speaking figuratively, so to speak. The relation of the relevant object to me is entirely ideal, that is constituted solely by social norms. Economic entities such as price and value have particular interest because they manifest a difference somewhat similar to the difference between a true hospital and a poor hospital. The object concept of an activity is determined by societal processes which set normative ideals. It is usually the case that these norms are not established by decisions of the Parliament or National Cabinet, but are the outcome of spontaneous social processes. Institutions and economic actors are then motivated by a complex of motivations to meet these norms, but do so only imperfectly, not ideally, as the unintended outcome of many independent actions. Aesthetic and legal entities are likewise ideal. They are material objects, documents, artworks, etc., which play a role, but ultimately their status depends solely on the patterns of activity in which the relevant documents and artworks figure. Now, the Cartesian realist in you might still insist, okay, activities give you concepts of the world by means of which we understand things, but those things still exist outside of our mind in the material world, right? What's going on here is the mixing up of artifacts and activities and conceptual norms as if they could exist separately, independently of one another. To explain the problem here, I introduced a concept of reification. Reification has a dual meaning. On the one hand, it means taking the norms of some human action and making them into an artifact. Computer programs do this all the time, but it has a long history. It can be supposed that at some point a hominid that was cracking coconuts using their own fist found that a stone plucked from nature could do the same very effectively, and we can suppose that the hammer evolved in much the same way. A hammer is a material norm of human labour. Norms can be implicit in actions or in artifacts. Without a detailed investigation of the real history of the cultural artifacts that humans have fashioned over the millennia, it can be reasonably supposed that this is a process of reifications, of converting the norms of human actions into tools and signs, material artifacts, which function in turn more effectively than our own bodies and laws and customs as the norms of human activity, human powers. The other meaning of reification is the practice of treating something which is nothing other than a material norm of human activity as if it were an objectively existing material object, rather than an artifact that is what it is, only thanks to being produced by and included in human activities. Take chairs, for example. We commonly think of chairs as objectively existing material entities. They are what they are, and anyone can recognize one of them if you see it. But it's not so simple. Sure, any person raised in a modern society knows a chair when they see one, but they don't all have 4 legs, and they don't all have a back or soft seats, and some are even quite dysfunctional for sitting on. Chairs have not always existed, and they do not exist in all societies today. Up until early modern times, you had thrones, but ordinary citizens had to stand or sit where they could. At a certain point, ordinary people started making their own thrones, and chairs made their appearance. People who make chairs know how to make them, and they know the properties and forms which must be imposed on materials to make a chair. Retailers know how to display them and market them. Householders and building managers know where to place them around the room, around tables and so on. And when we go into a room, we know how to sit in the chair. If a chair is uncomfortable or unstable, we don't say it's not a chair. We say it's a very poor chair, not matching its concept, right? But if it turned out to be made of tissue paper, we'd say it's a fake chair. Usually, our concept of chair turns out to have a sound basis in practice, though. Chair is a norm of a whole array of activities, practices, if you will. Chair is meaningless outside of a social formation in which the norms of chair use and chair manufacture exist. A chair is a reified norm of human action, sitting, existing only as a part of that action. I recall that I've said that in this ontology, material objects and processes exist, but only as a part of human activities from which we are able to abstract them. And as such, they don't have an objective existence. As Hegel said, what is only the one concrete whole. Yes, of course, a chair is a material object, meaning that it does exist independently of human activity, but not as a chair. An unusually low-hanging branch whose form arose without human intervention or observation would not be a chair, however much it resembled one in its physical properties and usefulness. The same synecdoche appears when we referred to the big building on the corner of Grattan Street and Royal Parade as a hospital. The building is not a hospital, it is merely a building currently being used by a hospital. Whether we are talking about institutions like hospitals or artifacts like chairs, I hope that I've explained that in either case, what is being referenced by means of a figure of speech is both a concept and an activity. Any of the activities we can identify and refer to in our language will necessarily also be an ideal, which is what it is, thanks to being an activity. But in any case, in the case of many of the concepts we use, it is less obvious and clear-cut. If you think that there's some neurological formation which instantiates each concept in your brain somewhere, then that's a huge declaration of faith. All the neuroscientists have been able to do, beyond sensing different intensities of activity in various sections of the brain, is to identify nerves actualizing various motor functions of the brain and how to stimulate them. They've been pretty successful in doing that, and that's interesting in itself, isn't it? It's feasible that the neuro people will one day be able to master the way the brain can cause us to pronounce a certain word or write it down or grab some object, but there is no chance whatsoever that they'll be able to tell us a set of neurological processes that corresponds to a concept. It is quite possible that the neurotechnicians could also evoke consciousness of a concept by manipulating the relevant sense and motor functions. Just showing someone a picture can do that. But the concept as such does not exist inside the head, but is in the entirety of a person's connection to the world, particularly the social world. We know this because we know how concepts develop through childhood. Here I can draw on the work of Lev Vygotsky, the founder of activity theory. The first thing is that children develop towards being able to form true concepts. As they do, their conceptions pass through a series of developmental phases, the most developed of which is learning to identify the word designating some artifact or action in the same way that adults use the word. This concept is called a pseudo-concept because it is a fake concept. The adults around the child may be fooled into thinking the child understands the concept in the same way they do, but in fact it does not. The child learns to identify sensual features of an artifact or action, the necessary and sufficient features of an object, but they do not have the concept of it. One day they'll make some little mistake and you'll realize that they didn't have the concept at all. Like a kid I had once who referred to the whack. What on earth is he talking about? Until we realized that the whack was the singular of wax, which referred to the little dribbles of wax covering a large candle stand we had, or the difficulty the little girl had to work out the identity of her brother's sister. Vygotsky was able to describe those pseudo-concepts and the more primitive and more advanced forms of conception, not by using an MRI machine, but by describing the set of actions through which the concept was realized. He did this by putting children into situations where they were motivated to solve some problem, and then he gave them words or signs which they learnt to help them solve the problem. The thing is that our concepts are intimately tied up with the words and other signs used in communicating with others and in commanding our own activity and stimuli originating from the context in which the relevant actions are done. At a certain moment in their development, children can be observed instructing themselves out loud on how to carry out some task. The concept and control of motor functions which are required to act out the actions associated with the concept are intimately tied up with speaking and hearing of the words of the action. For the action. Even as adults faced with a difficult task, we can sometimes revert to vocal self-command in this way. The only coherent and consistent way of describing a concept is in terms of the artifact-mediated actions and an ideal object concept. So the idea of a concept as a bundle of features is actually a childish misconception. However, even an intelligent adult, when they haven't quite yet grasped a new concept, will have a pseudo-concept instead. It is in interacting in the larger world outside of the family home, in professions, arts, politics, literature, the wide world of human culture originating beyond the horizons of everyday life, which creates the conditions for the formation of true concepts. We are raised in a culture and concepts. They are our connection to the world. Speaking psychologically for a moment, emotions are action readiness. An emotion begins as an embryonic action. This is true both in the formation of an actual action, which is in the appropriate context, grows out of an emotion, and when we merely think of doing something before we actually do it, or without even intending to do it. Then at the heart of that concept is a volitional moment, an emotional moment. Every concept has a corresponding emotional color, though it will depend on the context, the particular light which the concept evokes. So a concept is not something other than emotion, just that when we consider a concept under conditions very remote from its actualization, then that emotional content is hardly felt and is not carried through to action, but psychologically concepts are intimately connected to action. So let us consider for a moment living in some relatively stable social or cultural formation. Most of the concepts which make up this culture are activities whose history has long since been forgotten as the original activity has become integrated into the entire cultural formation. The content of the concept has obviously changed during this process of integration into the social formation, because the entire social formation also changed and kind of sucked the meaning out of any new concept as it was integrated into the activity of the entire community. The practical and emotional content of an activity has been integrated into the entire cultural formation, so that it takes on the form it is usually given in dictionaries, an infinite regress of references to other concepts, all of them drained of emotional color, now merely knots in a network. Each concept, once it is established, becomes just one special concept of the great concrete concept which constitutes the social formation as a whole. A concept in this sense is the final destination of an activity when it becomes just one nuance in the activity of the whole community. Look, I should say here, when I use the term social formation, it doesn't just mean a country or a community. It can mean a science or an art movement or a social movement, right? Social formation. It's characterized by certain self-concepts, certain kinds of activities. The content of a concept changes over time, and its original content is transformed by its integration into a social formation. As the social formation changes itself, its original content is obscured. To really understand the concept, you have to look back at the circumstances in which it first arose, the contradiction which was resolved by the intervention of a new form of activity and named by a word. The word continues, but its sense changes as the social conditions which originally gave rise to the new form of activity, the new concept, are gradually transformed around it, in part because of the intervention of the new concept itself. In general, to understand the concept and its place in existing culture, you have to trace back to that origin and reconstruct the whole journey up to the present. This is part of the understanding of the present social formation, tracing back to its origins, each one of the facets of the formation and the conditions under which it arose, and then tracking forward again and following its changes as conditions change. An entire social formation can only ultimately be understood in this way, in the correlation between concepts and their conditions, informed by perception of the contradictions breaking out in the formation at the present moment. To wind up, I've tried to justify the claim that activities and concepts are one and the same thing. This is despite the different connotations of the words and the complex relations between the psychology of concepts and the psychology of behavior and perception. It is impossible to talk about concepts and activities without allowing for the different connotations of these words, but nuances and connotations do not alter the fact that both words indicate the same entity. So Hegel's logic is the logic of activities. Activities are units of the social life of a community, just as concepts are the units of a life world and artifacts are the units of a material culture. In this formulation, each term indicates one or another element of human activity, and each term is meaningful only when it is understood as abstracted from the whole as one or another element of the same activities. So, first question from somebody.
The line that you had that said a hammer is a material norm of human labor.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could maybe just say some more about why a material object would be a norm. My brain just keeps getting stuck on that.
Yeah. When you think, well, how are norms, how do they take root in human society? We tell each other, we might even physically interfere with each other. Someone steps outside of a norm. They have an existence which is kind of implicit in what people do and therefore what you expect them to do. But they get into our activity not through mental telepathy, but only by things in the world. So when someone functions a hammer, you look at that and like, you don't pick it up by the head, you pick it up by the handle, and because you're a human being that's lived in modern society, you know what a handle looks like, and you grab it by the handle. And then, if someone's never put a nail into a bit of wood before, it can say, look, hit the nail with this. And the hammer sort of guides you in how to do it. It's big and heavy on that end. And it's pretty difficult to use a hammer other than the way it's meant to. Okay? So we sometimes, like the computer programmer is the really supremo of putting human norms into objects, because what they do is classically they watch how someone actually do it, can probably tell us exactly how it's done, but they look at how someone does something and all the like the branches, if this then that, and they write it up in such a way that when you use that program, it guides you into a certain kind of behavior. These are called algorithms that get people looking at what the advertisers want you to look at. So they're imposing a norm, not just reproducing a norm. And I mean, in the same line where Hegel says a hammer is a norm of human activity, he also said the word is the tool of reason. A word is a tool of reason. So he flipped it around. Not only can a hammer be a norm, as a word has a meaning, but even a word is also a tool. He's using the word tool, has to say metaphorically, not in that strict way as for acting on nature. Does that satisfy your question? Where you move? Well, just I was about to talk to you, Tom, wasn't it? Yeah. Did that help, Tom?
Yeah, I think so. So the word norm in this sense is like how we would usually think of it. Like it's just a standard of way of doing things.
Yeah, it's a standard. Look, in recent times, norm tends to get a bad name because that people become aware of differences. And so the expectation that people should behave in a certain way takes on this negative context. But norms aren't, they put it, they reflect expectations. And when people's expectations change, that means the norms changed. It doesn't just mean the average. The norms included of when, for instance, if you think of a musical composition, you can a good composer will throw in a note which is flat or sharp at a certain point, and it has a certain impact on you because it broke a kind of norm. It was off pitch, but they use that off pitch note to make a point. The same way people in the way we dress and behave, we can play with norms. So certain norms are very are very rigid. You know, you're not to poo in the middle of the street or in public, in fact, right? That's definitely, you know, something that's not expected, right? Does that help? Yeah?
Yeah, a lot. Thank
Good.
you.
Okay, Abet, this lecture was especially for you, Abet. I had you in mind when I was rehearsing it. So what's your question?
Yeah, the second definition, or the second way to interpret the word reification, it just struck me that I believe is one the more common interpretation of the word used by Marxists, because that is how he basically describes the whole commodity fetishism thing. And I guess as an example, because I've had some discussions with some colleagues of mine who used to be in the transport planning stuff back in government. A lot of the advocacies, particularly here in the Philippines, have to do with what they call car centrism, such that the idea that the way our infrastructure was built was because they had cars in mind. So the main points of such advocacies is to find a way to get rid of cars. My argument to that was that is a kind of a reification, a fetishization of an automobile. An automobile is ironically, an inanimate object.
Yep.
The problem of congestion, the problems that we have are rooted in thousands of people going through the same roads in the same places all at once. Why do they do that? Even if you took out automobiles and put bicycles in it, they will still rush to the same places all at the same time. It will probably have less traffic, but they're all still rushing to those dead-end jobs or whatever it is that it's the social relation that is hidden behind that thing, that automobile. And so the idea there is that if you reify or fetishize on an automobile, a thing, then your solution is another thing, a bicycle.
Yeah, but the other side of it, Abet, is that someone reified their idea of a way to live by building roads. And I mean, the famous story there is in the building of New York. You had all these lovely little villages that were genuine communities in the center of New York. And in the 1960s, I think early 60s, there's a game, the guy who ran all this, his name is famous, but it escapes me for a moment, said, oh, well, you know, people could live in the suburbs very happily. Now we've got cars, and built all these highways that's completely carved up these small communities. So the roads themselves were the reification and the creation of a norm by the reverse process. But you say, yes, that's it, but we can change that. But how are you going to make people change their activity? Well, you're going to have to make some more material norms. For example, by changing the employment practices so that people don't all start work at the same time. They have staggered weekends, if that's the world you want to live in. So, and you might think it's good having everyone working the same working hours because then they get to meet each other. Okay, then you get traffic jams. So, you know, you build an underground railway system, so you build a different artifact, you know, so you still, the norms that have been created, which may be troublesome, arise from earlier phases of creating material norms, which channel people into doing things. You have to change that probably by introducing new material norms. At the edge of that meaning of material norm is simply a different way of speaking. So people think you can change behavior by calling something a different name, right? If we stop using that rude word to describe a certain kind of people, use a nice word, then the hatred and denigration that goes with it will disappear. Of course, what happens is the denigration follows the word. So everything from building different types of you know, heavy steel and concrete infrastructure through the change of language is all creating a new norm to change activity. Yeah.
Yeah.
And dealing with the last generation's effort to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
Steve.
the point,
Sorry, go on.
okay. No, just one last, but because that's the point that I always wanted to make, at least with my more liberal, friends. The idea is that even if you took out that thing and replaced it with another thing, if the underlying relation for the I would call popularity, but for the necessity of that thing, people wanting to get
Yeah.
to work in is
Yeah.
not changed,
You have to
then
analyze the whole
yeah,
social
yeah,
formation which
yeah, it's
produces
the
that.
social formation that
Yeah.
produced it, and not just the thing as something that clogs up the road.
Yeah. Steve.
I found a couple of keywords interesting in your lecture, particularly normative and ideal. I found the definition of, well, not definition, the association between ideal and attachment to social significance really interesting. Now, I don't know, normally when we hear these words, normative or ideal, in theory or philosophy or whatever, we'd probably normally associate them, I think, with how we want something to be, or our kind of ethics about how we think things should be. So I guess I'm asking, to what extent in what we're talking about here, in this lecture, like, are we talking about like morality, like, you know, oughts and shoulds as opposed to logic, or are these or are, you know, logic and morality and shoulds in relation to concepts, are they kind of just all interrelated as part of, you know, a monist whole or something?
Look, ideal has quite a wide-ranging meaning, apart from the complexity of it being used in so many different conflicting ways. So an ideal is something whose existence is tied up with people's activity, right? So obviously the idea of something being ideal, meaning perfect, is closely related to it, but it's not identical in meaning. So something that's done poorly, the poor quality of that thing is also an ideal. It's an ideal judgment because you're judging it in relation to a human activity. But the meaning of a word, right? The meaning of a word is an ideal. It's not contained in the spelling or the sound of the word as such. It's an ideal. So you can have two words that sound different and mean the same, and the same word, two words that sound the same but have different meanings because of their context. But we, being human beings, are brought up in society in a certain language. We are able to disentangle it. So the meaning of a word is an ideal, and if you like, meaning is called a semantic norm. Right, so the concept of norm is very close to the concept of ideal. A norm carries this implication of it being an expectation. So don't worry about shoulds. Expectation, the basis of an expectation, like it is not necessarily morality. It might be self-interest. Yeah. It's just what we expect, and we expect something. I mean, I talked, I think, early on about the gravity is like a norm of falling objects. That's a metaphor, really, because we don't apply norms to laws of gravity. So aspects of human behavior like that definitely are norms. It's how we expect people to behave, and that has a force, because how you expect determines how you're going to react. So if you think another person is going to act like this, however they do act, it's going to make you want to act in a corresponding way, and that will be a normative response because you're interpreting the other person as being normative. Okay, so when anything we're talking about human life, it's all talking about norms. Now you can say, oh, yesterday this happened and that was really funny. Okay, that wasn't the norm, or the funniness was. It's just something that actually happened. But any generalization you make is all just talking about norms, the way we expect and way people do behave. Pauline.
Hey, I found it really interesting, and you talked at the start about how we have this tendency for synecdoche, is that right? And those taken
fantastic.
the taken for granted connotations, where we make this dualistic distinction between concepts and activities, and it kind of relates back to idealism and materialism as well in some ways. And you highlighted that this is, you know, both due to that Cartesianism, but also that as humans, we need to have that shorthand way of distinguishing between what we're imagining and what's existing outside in our outside of our own individual consciousness.
The Cartesian dualism isn't wrong, right? There is a fundamental distinction between something you imagine and something that exists in the world. The point I make is it's not a good starting point, because we've actually got a triplet. We've got the activities, the objects we use, and the actions, right? So my proof of a triplet didn't work out very well. There are so many different triplets around, I forgot where I was. Sorry, I interrupted you, Pauline. Continue.
No, that's okay. I think it's good to, like, you do talk about how it's actually both as well. And, you know, activities are concepts, concepts are activities, but also you talk a lot about that tripartite structure to things. Yeah. I was just wondering, is this sort of reflex that we have to make this make just a very simplistic distinction between concepts and activities culturally mediated, not a universal kind of situation? Because it seems to me that Hegel or Hegelian thought is really helping us to critique or overcome that kind of problem in Western thought in particular.
Yeah, I remember I was at a meeting marking the 200th anniversary of Hegel's Phenomenology, and yet another person stood up and ranted against the Cartesian dualism. And a very good Melbourne Hegelian, Paul Ashton, stood up and said, would anyone who doesn't feel that dualism please put their hand up, that doesn't feel the difference between the material world and the world of the, you know, the mind? Complete silence, right? So look, it's humans that want to live and not die the first encounter with something dangerous. We have to know the difference between a thought you had and reality. But if we want to build a critical science to understand that, and you set out like the French of signifier and signified, or like Descartes with the extension and ideal, you just get into conundrums. It is actually side by side with that mental material is the object that the concept that is bringing a whole series of actions into a coherent whole, and the objects you use to mediate those actions and the actions themselves, right? And unless you can disentangle that, you won't be able to actually understand it. But when we speak and explain things, we're always talking about this action or that idea or that thing, yeah? And has to be so. But as you say, yeah, it's the insight that's required to pull it apart and see what's really going on. Dirk.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. This is great. I really enjoyed the chat that we had in our little breakout room. There's only two of us, so just so you know, it was small. But yeah, I am a programmer. I don't know if anyone else in the room is. And I think that it does provide sort of a mental modeling that you're already very accustomed to, but not within the context of removing the dualism. But as an engineer or a programmer, you build concepts as objects in code, and you get given, we don't meet with the people, we don't find out what they do, you get given the requirements, right? Like there's structures and structures in these organizations. And within all of that then is the like human activity of making changes and deciding, but then you write the rules down and they're in code and that's enforced on people's lives. The people who use that system then are controlled by those rules. But then you learn as a software developer, they don't follow those rules. It's just like the architect who realizes people cross the pathway because it's easier. They'll use software in a way that you weren't expecting them to use. That's a bug, comes into as a bug, but they're using it as a feature because they need the software to work one way, but the software's, it's all human activity is what it comes down to.
Yeah, great comparison. The architect, you know, the architect that builds a path across an open space that's got a right angle in it, and everyone walks and wears a hole in the grass, walking the direct line, you know. Yes, the world we live in is one where people are transgressing norms all the time. And the builder of infrastructure, whether it's the wordsmith or the architect, or is in some way trying to regulate that behavior in some direction. We all are. When we speak to people and say, I agree with you, or I don't agree with you, we're trying to regulate behavior of someone else at some time, right? So always involved in pushing these norms around. But we rely on the fact that words have normative meaning, you know, and that things are built in such a way that they're useful more or less for certain purposes. We couldn't live without those norms, but by transgressing them, we move the norms. You know, when everyone drives down a certain street at 80k and ignores the little 60k sign on the side, that norm is ruined until the cops turn along and stay there every day for a week or something and finding people and bring the norm back into being. You know? Excellent. Thanks, Dirk. Michael.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for that. I really enjoyed it. I'm kind of working through some of what you offered in my head as I talk, so forgive me if I'm a little bit inarticulate. And I suppose I'm coming from a place of curiosity here and wondering aloud how the idea of a concept as a norm might apply on a higher level. And by high level, I mean something broader. So the examples that you offered, I believe you used a hospital and you talked about a hammer. Those are all quite particular examples. And I wonder if that's something that you'll speak to with regards to a norm being something like a concept that is put into practice on a larger scale. And obviously, well, what might be obvious is that I'm very keen to hear like the Marxism side of things and what you might have to offer about that. But that's just all I have.
Norms cover a huge scope of things, Michael. Consider the rules of war, or international law in antiquity, right? But these are real things. They exist. There are norms of law, and thank goodness for that. But of course, you know, what do you do if someone just invades a country when, according to the norms, they shouldn't? Well, that's something then the world has to cope with. What if someone then starts putting, landmines all around the place? They shouldn't. It's against the rules of law at the moment, but they do. But is the kind of problem that Dirk pointed to of architects that build a building in a certain way, you know, when people persistently, do something that the building wasn't meant to allow for, then sooner or later there'll be a revision on the building and a wall will be knocked out or a light will be put in that hallway or whatever. And one way or another, we develop either through the failure of norms or through their deliberative breach. But without them, we're sunk, right? But they, on complete scope, I take international law as an example in that extreme. And of course, they're the most intangible, but they've still got written international law and international courts of law and so on, and people get sentenced for doing the wrong thing. Rachel.
Hi, Andy. Sorry if I've missed this. You might have already answered it, and I've just not heard it properly. When you were describing transgressions to norms, I was wondering whether you consider those transgressions inherent within the norm itself or an external factor to the norm. So I guess an example I would maybe give to follow on from the ones you gave is the right-angled path. It's not a coincidence. It's not random where people cut across. It is almost baked into the right angle that people use it in a specific way. Dirk's example of programming, a lot of those bugs that come out as features are inherent to the program itself, and within law as well. Certain loopholes, people call them loopholes, but sometimes they are just laws around collecting tax do inherently facilitate tax evasion.
Yeah. Look, Rachel, all of the above, the way norms develop, the way human society develops, is sort of infinitely complex. And you're right, sometimes, in a sense, always, if a norm proves inadequate, then there's something wrong somewhere. It may have been a perfectly good norm, but there were other factors going on. Like, for example, a couple of, maybe several thousand years ago, someone came down from the mount and said, "Thou shalt not kill," right? For 3,000 years, whatever it is, I don't know exactly when Moses had his revelation, but a long time ago, people have been revising that rule. And also not only revising the rule, saying, I think I've used this metaphor before, but, except if you're at war, or unless they're a prisoner, or unless it's in self-defense. But also we pay attention to the conditions that give rise to murders. So we start paying special attention to domestic abuse, to controlling behavior. We educate men about the proper way of treating women, because we know there are a range of things there that lead to murder. So you've got probably the definition of murder in a law book now probably fills a room, right? But the social policies which are developed and continue to develop are also supporting that. Yes, norms sometimes have the seeds of their own collapse built into them, but sometimes, I mean, there's very few norms that survive more than a generation without having to be modified in some way. And really, I mean, the book itself, Hegel for Social Movement, starts with the line, if you want to plant an idea in the world, then Hegel's your man, right? Because he's talking about the way ideas exist in the world, how they exist as norms, right? As ideals, norms, concepts. And he's studied the logic of them, how they change, how they interact with one another. So really, if you want to change the world, then study Hegel, because he wrote the manual a long time ago, and it's imperfect, but it's got the material there that probably needs to be improved and thought through. But it's all about how norms, that's to say, really existing ideas, manage to exist in the world.